today. I have the privilege of introducing you to David Dylan Thomas. He is the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, and a 20-year practitioner of content strategy and UX. He has consulted major clients in entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail. As the founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas LLC, he offers workshops and presentations on inclusive design and the role of bias in making decisions. He is presented on TED New York City, SXSW Interactive, Confab, An Event Apart, LavaCon, UX Copenhagen, Artifact, Information Architecture Conference, IXDA, Design and Content Conference, Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise, and the Wharton Web Conference on topics on the intersection of bias, design, and social justice. So without further ado, I would like to present to you our David Thomas.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Gonna share my screen now. And there we go. And hoping you can see my screen now. And here we go. Yeah. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out for Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. My name is David Dylan Thomas, founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas LLC, where I try to get people excited about and give them tools for inclusive design. And yeah, I wrote this book, Design for Cognitive Bias, came out last year. And I want to tell you a little bit of the road to this book begins with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to that podcast actually begins with this woman. Her name is Bonnet. And a while back, she gave a talk called Gender Equality by Design. It's a fantastic talk, and I highly recommend you check it out. It's on YouTube. And one of the ideas she puts forward is this idea that a lot of implicit racial and gender bias basically comes back to pattern recognition, right? So let's imagine that you are hiring a web developer. The words web developer, the image, like unbidden, that kind of pops into your head might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you actually think that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that's been built up from movies, from television, from maybe even some offices you've worked in, kind of makes that equation. And so if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that pattern, all of a sudden you're giving that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as implicit racial or gender bias could come back to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for biases. There's well over 100 here, and I realized I am not going to figure this out in a day. So I took one a day, and then the next day I'll learn about the next one. And this would turn me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. So eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, it's worth establishing from the jump, what is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's a series of cuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk or what to do with my hands or where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's that a lot of our lives are spent on autopilot, but sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a really high number, you tend to roll the die pretty hard. If you need a lower number, you tend to roll it gently. And we all know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die, but in situations where we don't have control, we like to feel like we have control, and we embody that desire by how hard we roll the die. Now, this one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias, and it happens when you get stuck in your head, and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. Now, we saw this play out at the beginning of the Iraq War. The whole idea was we need to go in there because Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and we need to get him before he gets us. As it turns out, within a year, the president of the United States, who had insisted there were weapons there, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, many people still believed there were weapons of mass destruction there. So many that even 14 years later, Over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats were sure, yep, there were weapons of mass destruction there. So an extremely powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it. Now, these biases are hard to fight. Part of the problem is that you may not even realize you have the bias, right? There's a bias blind spot where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. And part of the problem is about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. So you're making these decisions so quickly, you don't even realize you've made them. So the next time somebody asks you to get something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it anyway. There's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody watching this to write down the last two numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, okay, we are going to bid on a bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers, probably going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers, probably going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. But here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we begin the experiment. You'd probably still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to do it. You probably still do it. Now, the reason we need to care about cognitive bias as designers is a thing called choice architecture. And you can see this play out when you go buy food at a grocery store, right? Go buy produce. Common wisdom is you never reach from the top of the barrel, because that is where the grocer is going to put the product they're most trying to move, the oldest product. They're putting it where it's easiest to reach. They have architected that situation to benefit themselves. Now, they could just as easily put the fresh where it's to reach and architect that benefit the customer. Is however they architect that experience, that will influence the decisions you make within that experience. So think about the decisions your user needs to make, and then think about how people make this decision. How people make decisions, right? Not how rational people make decisions, because in a way there's kind of no such thing. No, how do people who are making 95% of their decisions without even realizing it, how do they make decisions? As it turns out, there are content and design choices we can make to help keep some of these biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. Let's go back to the skinny white guy, right? So as it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have two identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it's a male sounding name, it tends to keep going through the process. If it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay on the pile. But here's the thing. Why do you information, right? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision, are things like the qualifications, the experience. What might actually be getting in the way could be the gender or the race, or really whatever you're reading into the name in terms of the gender or the race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position. And one of the things they discovered is that if you want to, even in the high-tech world of web development, if you want an anonymized resume, best way to do it, physically print out the resume, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. Next thing they discovered is that once they found a resume they liked, they'd go to GitHub, right, to try to find, that developer's portfolio, so to speak. Problem is, the second they go to GitHub and the profile loads, there's all the personal information, right? The experiment is ruined. So clever people that they are, they wrote a Chrome plugin, right, that would anonymize all that information as the page loaded. And just to complete the circle, they took that code, put it back on GitHub, and it is there now if you ever want to try to use this yourself. This isn't just about helping humans make hiring decisions. Amazon had a hiring bot, which basically would sift through resumes, right? And they noticed that it was extremely sexist. If it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. So they tried to figure out how it became so sexist, and they asked themselves, well, how did we train this AI? Well, they trained it on the past 10 years of resumes. What those resumes had in common? It's mostly guys. So the AI took one look at that and said, gee, you sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. We have this illusion that AI is this cold, rational machine, when in fact, it's basically a glorified prediction engine. And if you point it at a racist, sexist world, it's going to make racist, sexist predictions. Now, this can go in the opposite direction, right? So Amazon Go is a store where you walk in, take what you want, and you leave. And then Amazon will automatically deduct whatever you took from your account. Now, this had a very curious effect for Ashley Clark Thompson, who wrote an article for CNET called, "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." She's referring to a phenomenon known as shopping while black, which manifests as hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? In Amazon Go, there was no one there to do that to her. And by removing one key design element, namely the staff, Amazon was able to create a less biased experience for this customer. This even is beginning the justice system. So district attorneys have incredible leeway when it comes to deciding whether or not to bring charges when a crime is committed. Perhaps not surprisingly, they are more likely to bring charges when the accused is black than if the accused is white, even for the same crime. So, not unlike the resumes, the DA's office said, well, why do we need that information anyway, right? So they started producing crime reports that omitted the race and gender of the victim, the race and gender of the accused, and even the race and gender, even the location of the crime, in an attempt to create a less biased decision from the DA. Another term we really want to think about is cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably hard to do. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been making a lot of pancakes lately. And this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of clumped together and it's kind of small. And I might glance at that and think, I don't know. I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. And I can take that same content, give it big full width imagery and more scannable bursts of text, and I might glance at that and think, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now think about that when I'm deciding whether or not I want to drive or take public transportation. Now, if I take one look at that printed schedule, I immediately conclude that public transportation is impossible. I'm going to drive my car. I take a look at that app screen, and before I've read a word, I might conclude that, you know what, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see your faces, so I'm going to ask you to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913. But the point is, people often pick 1914. Reason being, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. What gets worse is that if something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this also has consequences. Now, what we think is happening here is that if something is easier to process, right, we tend to like it more. We tend to believe it more. Things that are easier to process feel more certain, and we love certainty, and we hate uncertainty, and we'll throw logic under the bus to get to certainty. So things that are easier to process feel more certain, and I'll give you an example. If I asked you, what did you get for your 5th birthday, right? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel too certain about that answer. It is hard to remember. It's hard to process. It doesn't feel very certain. If I ask you, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Okay, probably feel pretty easy to remember. It's pretty easy to process. Feels pretty certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that use big, bold fonts, right, and clear imagery and clear language, easier to process, feel more certain. Now, this is important when it comes to things we need to believe. In this country, there is a crisis where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In 2002, when given the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agree with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me and said, okay, that's great in theory, but can you point to actual instances where plain language and have saved lives? And I'm glad she pushed me on it because it forced me to do the work and find these really interesting examples. Here's a situation where you have women who are smoking while pregnant. When they were given materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to stop smoking during pregnancy and even 6 weeks postpartum. Here you have people who are caregivers, right, helping other people take their medication. And when they were given a plain language pictogram-based intervention, right, you saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medicine. Now, you might think that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. A while back, a whole bunch of different states roll out legislation that says if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own does a lot of good, right? Especially with older drivers, but not as much with younger drivers. So they roll out click it or ticket, and the results are national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% respectively. Just to put that in terms, for every percentage point you go up in people actually buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So if you do the rough math, that's almost 4,000 lives saved in part through rhyming. It is silly, but it works. Now, this whole easy to process thing even extends to names. There's literally a name pronunciation effect. And it basically says if your name is easier to pronounce, it can affect things like voting preference and occupational status. Now, with the caveat that easy to pronounce is a culturally sensitive, context. So in some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In other cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, well, you kind of got it made. They firms, and the higher you went up in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks, right? If you've got a stock that's about to have an IPO, the stock, if it's easier to pronounce, if it's it's easier to process, it tends to do better. If even the little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform. So we will lay down real money on things that are easier to process. The most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out pretty simple. Let's say I go to a store and I see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And next to it, I see a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to walk up to? It's the same thing. I just framed one of them to seem more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? Asking whether it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are bilingual, multilingual, you actually have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you're less likely to fall for the scam. So I speak a little bit of French. So if I think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's boeuf, that's a lot of vowels. Let's say 95%, that's, no, wait. And by the time I'm done all that processing, right, I can see right through the scam. And that's the thing, I've slowed down my thinking. Things happen when you're thinking too fast. It turns out the framing effect can actually be used for good. So there's an experiment where you show a photo like this to an audience and you ask, should this person drive this car? And what you get is basically a policy discussion. And some people are saying, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people are saying, oh, how dare you, that's ageist. People should do what they want. All you learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person, or all you really learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now I can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what I'll get is really a design discussion, right? And some people might say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what I'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I iris out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. We can even see this play out in student evaluations of teachers, which is yet another realm where women tend to be disadvantaged. Students tend to rate their female professors more harshly than they do their male counterparts, even for the same material. So Iowa State University did an experiment where they said, okay, we're going to give some of the students 2 paragraphs before they fill out the survey. And the paragraphs basically say just that. This is an area where women and people of color are generally disadvantaged. When you are making your evaluation, please make sure you're using real criteria and not just appearance, right? The students who got those 2 paragraphs as a frame tended to rate their female professors higher than the students who did not. I want to close by talking about our biases, because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. So let's talk about notational bias. And you can see this play out when you think about sheet. Grew up playing the saxophone, learn how to read music like this, which is standard Western notation. And I came to believe that there's any music in the world, you could write it down this way and then I could play it. But the fact of the matter is, it's just not true. There is a lot of African music, a lot of Asian music for which this notation system just doesn't work. And if this becomes the standard, it is remarkably easy to erase lots of culture. Now, we see this more often when we're creating forms that ask for personal information. If I have it in my head that there's only 2 genders, and I make my forms that way, it's easy for me to eradicate any number of identities. By the way, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about the self-serving bias. So this is a bias where if something goes well, that's my fault, and if something goes poorly, that's your fault. This plays out with computers as well. If I'm doing something on a computer and something goes well, I'll blame myself. If something goes poorly, I'll blame it on the computer. Unless I've given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame myself if something goes wrong and the computer if something. So very thoughtful how often we ask personal information, because the more we do it, we'll be creating this unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. So we see notational bias play out all the time in structured content. So until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. So the way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name, you would basically say her full name. And then every mention after that, you would either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. Now think about the pattern, and remember how important patterns are. Think about the pattern that sets up. It basically says the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, then maybe her last name. Now think about that in article after article after article for over 100 years. So we need to be very careful how we create editorial guidelines and how we structure content, because that is an easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. Back in the day, you had vice basically tries to figure out what he can get away with. He talks to his lawyers, and his lawyers tell him, look, you are a member of the executive branch, but you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you are also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be part of the executive branch and part of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, well, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same thing play out with software like Facebook, right? When it suits them, Facebook positions itself as a publisher, right? Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out that there are actually rules for publishers, they're like, well, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us think more inclusively about how we write. Radical Copy Editor is an excellent resource for really understanding how to write about different people who usually don't get a lot of say in how they're written about. Textio is fantastic for writing more inclusive job descriptions, right? Because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term I think we should think about is evidentiality, right? So that English doesn't have, but other languages do. Some other languages. So evidentiality, it has to do with how you use verb tense. English uses verb tense pretty much to tell you when something happened, right? So Bob went to the store. Bob is going to the store. Bob will go to the store. Other languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting, right? So they're there to tell you how I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store. And then a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. Point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know that Bob went to the store. Now think about how that would affect what people are willing to post, what people are willing to say in a speech if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English lacks this as a mandatory feature, but I feel like there are ways we can introduce it using design. So remember how I said that if something is easier, it feels a little more true? Well, if it's harder to read, it also doesn't feel quite as true. So this is from an article that came out when the first teaser trailer dropped for the new 007 film. And the first paragraph is basically confirmable information. This is the name of the movie. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor director got fired. First paragraph is fairly easy to read, fairly easy to believe. Second paragraph is a little bit harder to read, and it's a little bit harder to believe, and it should be, it's a rumor. So I think we can use design to signal to our users just how many grains of salt they should be taking some of this content with. Told you we come back to this one. So for a long time, I had a misunderstanding of what the scientific method was. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. If I get a good result, I'll write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. And if they all get a good result, great. Check that off. It's a law. Let's move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out that it's a little more complicated than that. I have an idea about how I am going to test that idea. If I get a good result, a whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. And if they all get a good result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Let me go and try and prove that. Now, that is a much more rigorous approach, and it was designed specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it is remarkably easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you just how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with a computer, and the computer is going to show us these numbers in the question mark and ask us, put whatever number you want where the question mark is, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you are ready, I will tell you. When you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. So if you're like me, you start off with 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. Even numbers, the pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a more elegant solution. Probably easier to code it, probably cheaper to build, but I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools to help us avoid this outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And it's this idea that you have a blue team who does the initial research, maybe gets as far as a prototype. Before they go much further, the red team comes in for one day, and the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. And they're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical, right? I don't have to go to my boss and say, okay, look, we now got to hire 2 teams for every single job, and they got to look at each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely we're going to put something harmful out into the world. One of the things I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of outside perspectives. This is Norman Ohler, and he wrote a book called Blitzed, which is about Nazis on drugs. He had a German DJ friend of his who said when he was growing up in Munich, all the World War vets would talk about how they were high all the time. And Norman takes his friend at his word and does the research, and sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. Here's what they were giving the German soldiers. It's basically meth. Here's what they were giving Hitler. It's basically oxy. And by the way, here's what they were giving the German populace. Now, World War II is a not unexplored topic, right? There are tons and volumes of things written about World War II, but somehow the historians miss this. How? My guess, the Venn diagram of historians and people with familiarity with recreational drug use is kind of thin. And if our German DJ friend had gone up to one of these historians and said, hey, did you know the Nazis were on drugs? A lot of them might have said, okay, whatever, junkie. But Norman, who was also familiar with recreational drug use, took his friend at his word and did the work. Now, the point is, if you were asking me, Dave, we're writing a book about World War II, who should we talk to? My first answer wouldn't be German DJ, but it would be a fantastic answer, right? Another thing that we have trouble with in design is thinking about the unhappy path, right? We sell design based on the happy path. Hey, we're going to rebuild your website and look how awesome it's going to be and look at all these cool new features, without realizing necessarily that for every new feature that could go right, there's about 15 different things that could go wrong. So we should spend at least as much time designing for what could go wrong as we do for what could go right. Part of the reason we have a problem with the unhappy path is survivorship bias. So you can see this play out in the story of Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald is a brilliant mathematician living in Austria in the 1930s. Unfortunately, he was also a Jew living in Austria in the 1930s, and he had to get out before Hitler got in. And he did. He made it to the States. And when he was there, he was asked to help out with the war effort. And one of the problems he was asked to help solve was the fact that a lot of planes just kept getting shot down. And they wanted to know, where should we put armament on these planes to make it less likely that they get shot down? So they put them in a room with a whole bunch of these planes that have bullet holes in them and a whole bunch of other scientists. And most of the other scientists are saying, what are you talking about? This is easy. Just where the bullet holes are, put more armament. But our friend Abraham says, no, actually, it's the opposite. You want to put more armament where you don't see the bullet holes. Why? Because he realized they were looking at the survivors, right? They were looking at the planes that were shot up, but not so bad that they couldn't make it back. They needed to worry about the planes that were shot up so bad that they went down and never came back. They were thinking about the survivors. They needed to be thinking about the ones that were not so lucky, and those clearly were shot where these planes were not. Now, one of the tools that can help us think about the unhappy path is speculative design, right? And it's kind of like that show Black Mirror, where you take some technology, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone for tech. You take some future technology and you tell a story about how it would play out if real human beings got their hands on it. And it's always terrible. In fact, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is a real job. So Superflux went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we stay on the road of fossil fuels, or should we, start investing in renewables? So one of the things that Superflux did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on the road of fossil fuels, 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it, and then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to even 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another thing you can do is an assumption audit to really get your biases out on the table. So an assumption audit is where you get your whole team in a room before you begin the project, and you ask these 5 questions. What identities does your team represent? And you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're thinking about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity, right? Then you're going to ask, how might those identities influence the design of this thing we're making? Then you're going to ask, what identities are not represented by this group? Who isn't in the room, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? How might that lack of perspective compromise the design of this thing we're working on? Finally, you're going to ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in the design process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, serve people, honor, maybe pay them for their time. Give power. Are there people who are going to be impacted by this work who have no say in this work? And how do we give them more say? Because they are going to have to live with the thing that we build. One of my favorite examples of this came with the show The Mandalorian, which I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's this sci-fi epic, Star Wars based. And there's this alien race that speaks mostly in sign language. And one of the people working on it said, look, I have a friend who's actually deaf, and we should have them come in and play one of these roles. And then they helped actually develop part of this complex language. And what I love about this tweet is the last line. It's our responsibility when we're in the room to look around and see who's missing. Now, when you're trying to figure out who to invite to the table, it's good to think about power, right? So there is a process called Participatory Design, and it thinks very much about how power plays out through the design process. And one of the first things you do is draw a power map, right? And you want to figure out who has very little power in this process and who has a lot, and who has low interest, right? Who isn't going to really be impacted by what we make, and then who's going to be impacted a lot by what we make. And what you're looking for are the lower right quadrant who are going to be very impacted by the work, but who have no say in the work. And then you're going to figure out through the process of participatory design how to give them more say. So an example might be work that the Office of Homeless Services did, or that the City of Philadelphia did with the Office of Homeless Services. The idea was to redo the intake process for people experiencing homelessness. And so it's this big service design project. And one of the things you could do in that situation is say, okay, who here has, is going to be really impacted by this, but it has very little say in the process, and that would be the people who are experiencing homelessness, right? And then a little bit up from that, the people who are, providing those services for them. So the project of participatory that project is to try to move them right from that low power to high power, right? And the way you do that is by reporting back, right? So it isn't just I'm going to interview a few of you and never see you again. It's like, no, once I've synthesized my research, I'm going to come back and say, did I get this right? And when we're designing, we're going to co-create with you. And before the design is finished, we're going to ask, did we get this right? And before anything is implemented, right, we're going to ask, did we get this right? Because again, you have to live with the thing that we are making. The last bias I want to talk to you about is called the déformation professionnelle. And it's a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world some of us live in might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were, right? They were getting really difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a pretty high price. What they were not doing such a great job at was being human beings. Now, when the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, took the job, he asked all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? Many of them would answer to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job was to protect civil rights? Now, that encompasses enforcing the law, but that is a much bigger job, right? Because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I've had this slide in here for a while now, but in the past couple of years, it has become even harder to get through. But I keep it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs as a matter of life and death. Ramsey was telling his officers that day that their jobs are harder than they think. And I'm here to tell us our jobs are harder than we think. It's not just design cool stuff, right? We have to find a way to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, folks have already started to work on this, right? You have Mike Montero at Mule Design. He's got a design ethics booklet. It's like a Hippocratic oath for designers. You have, a code of ethics in that booklet that has things like a designer is first and foremost a human being. You have the Design Justice Network that is doing amazing work in this area. You should look and see if there's a node in your neighborhood. But they have these 10, right? I'm just going to read you the first two. Principle 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to these first two, you have got your work cut out. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're kind of doing the latter. The good news, in my opinion, is that these are not new questions that we have to tackle. The study of ethics has been with us for over thousands of years, right? And the Mercury Center for Applied Ethics does a great job of really whittling down a lot of that wisdom into key questions that you can ask about the thing you're working on, right? So which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtue approach. This wisdom has been with us forever, but it's time we start actually using it in our products. Is another resource here, right? And basically it's this website and there are these cards and you click on them and they flip over and give you these really provocative questions about the thing you're working on. So how might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself before it launched, we might live in a very different world today. We're seeing this start to pop up in design systems, right? So Adobe has their new design system, and that has a whole section dedicated to more inclusive UX writing. Intuit is starting to get into this realm as well. And a design system is an excellent place to embed that because design systems proliferate out to the rest of the company. Software engineers are getting on this, right? So you have the Never Again pledge that a lot of data scientists and software engineers got together and signed when they saw that their work with data was being used to hurt immigrants. And they said, look, there's this long history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. We don't want to be a part of that history. And here is a list of things that we will do to make sure that doesn't happen, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. Action play out at places like Google, where you have Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And when the people working on it saw what it was, they said, look, we didn't get into this business to build weapons. If you make us work on this, we're walking. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million project with the military. Then they turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. So this battle is still being fought. Now, if you were thinking about fighting this battle yourself, it could help to know about consistency bias. The way consistency bias works is if I come up to you and I say, hey, I want to put this big honking sign on your lawn, you're probably going to say no. But if I come up and say, I just want to put this tiny, you're not even going to notice it, it's this little, you'll probably say yes. If you say yes, and then I come back a couple weeks later and say, hey, can I put this big sign on your lawn? you're actually more likely to say yes because you're sign people. Decisions that are consistent with their former selves. So if I'm trying to roll out inclusive design, I could try to say, hey, we're going to create an inclusive design committee and we're going to meet every Monday and like roll out a whole new process for everybody to follow. That is a meeting engine. Instead, what's the smallest little on the next project? I asked to do an assumption. It's just a 2-hour meeting. This whole project's like 600 hours. Just let me 2 hours. Just nothing. My boss says yes. Great. I do that on a few projects. Then I come back and I say, hey, on this next project, can I get 1 day for a red team? It's a 90-day project. Just give me 1 day, right? They're more likely to say yes because, well, I guess we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers' profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this to be true, and it is only more true today. So the question I will leave us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions really quick for David? If so, would you mind actually posting them in the regular session chat as opposed to the Q&A area? And also, if you haven't yet, you should really get this book. His book is amazing. I'm actually haven't finished it yet, but what I've read is really great.
Thank you so much.
Let's see if we have any questions coming in. I'm also going to drop a Slack channel in case anyone wants to continue this conversation. I will drop that in the chat right now.
And I'll put some resources in that channel too, if you ever want to follow up on any of these ideas.
Excellent. Yeah. So if everyone wants to continue on with this conversation, jump into that Slack channel right now. David's going to continue the conversation there with some resources. I don't see any questions coming in right now, but that doesn't mean that maybe some people have some that they're thinking of, and they'll ask you soon. But thank you, David. This is incredible. Yeah. We're so happy to have you. Thank you for sharing this time with us and all your insights on all these various biases that really affect the work we do.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Cheers.
See you in the Slack. Bye.